everybody, it's Helen Hillix, your host for From My Heart to Yours and YouTube channel, Helen Hillix. And I have the great pleasure today of having Briana MacWilliam, who is a relationship coach who specializes in attachment theory work and wonderful ways of integrating art into that work as a way of, from my perspective, bypassing the brain and really getting to the heart of things in an energetic way. And it's very powerful work. And I want Briana to tell you all about it. And I'm so excited to have her today, especially during this pandemic, sheltering at home, quarantine time, because what better time to work on your relationship. Mm-hmm. So welcome, Briana, and thank you so much for coming. And would you please tell us a little bit about your background, your biography, so to speak, your certifications?
Sure. So my name is Briana MacWilliam, and I am a licensed and board certified creative arts therapist. And so basically what that means is I'm trained to be a psychotherapist, but we are trained in how to use creative modalities as a way to kind of get at the unconscious, impulses that compel us, or the reasons we do the things that we do. So we engage in therapy, or in my case, I do more coaching with a lot of the same training and information that a normal therapist might, but we have this sort of layer of using creative modalities as a way to address those things.
And you also have a lot of training in sex education and sexology and sacred sexuality, right?
I have explored it, probably not as officially as looking at attachment styles, but I have explored, and in my own personal experiences, looking at sacred sexuality. And I like thinking about the sort of interplay between polarities, how we hold what's often called masculine and feminine polarities, but I tend to think of it as alpha and omega, similar to like London Winters is another coach who talks about these things. The idea of how do we inhabit these energies that we hold within us, this energy that's very directed and focused and an ability to contain. And then there's the energies that we have, which are expansive and organic and creative and expressive, and in relationship, I think with partners, we tend to hold those polarities for each other, or we butt heads when each of us is sort of vying for control and holding either one of them. And I see a lot of this playing out in attachment styles. And I think sometimes there's some confusion over what is really an insecure like manifestation of these things versus what is just a miscommunication, and how that then leads to either a strengthening or weakening of intimate relationship, right?
I am so with you on this, renaming the masculine and feminine to alpha and omega. I really appreciate that. I want to back up just a little bit and have you first talk about why you think this is the perfect time for people to dive into their relationships. As this is going to be published on, I don't know, April 14th or something, 2020, right in the middle of a pandemic at the ascending peak of death in America. So it's like, why is now the perfect time?
Well, it's interesting because I'll tell you a couple of personal stories around that, actually. So I have a private Facebook group, and we've got about 6,000 members in there. And if anything, the activity in that group has increased. The questions have increased around, how do I relate to my partner? I've been locked in the apartment with them for weeks on end, and we are at each other's throats. Or things, conflicts that may have been long ignored because you can just wake up and go to work and not talk about it, and then watch TV when you come home and not have to deal with it because tomorrow you just wake up and go to work again. But now we don't have those kind of external circumstances to buffer those things in a way. So there's some increased pressure around, let's say, people who are in close proximity who may have some difficulty negotiating it. Now, on the other hand, we also have the circumstance where, You have people who may have just been starting something, or something may have been budding, or something may have been on the cusp of an increasing commitment. And now there's this forcible separation that has occurred. And there's this quandary about how now do we redefine our connection? Do we know each other well enough to be able to step into that? Are we brave enough or vulnerable enough to attempt connecting in other ways? Can we still keep the sexual energy and tension alive between us through digital communication? Does this feel sleazy? Do I feel too exposed in this way? Is this medium something that I've had a stigma against, and now I'm being asked to engage with it to keep a sense of intimacy with my partner? There's
love it. I love all these questions. Well, I do want to talk about attachment theory and creative arts, but you know what? I would love for you to give an answer to a couple of those questions, to converse about that, because I love the last one that you mentioned, Briana, about what about people who have had a real prejudice against virtual communication, just as we are right now on Zoom. And, you and I are completely comfortable with it because we've been doing it for years. Mm-hmm. But people, exactly that example that you just gave, I love that. Of what if you're in a budding relationship and you really think you care about this person, and maybe you've had sex 1 or 2 times, or you've made out and haven't had sex yet. How do you make that? What do you tell people in terms of taking that next step in perhaps even deepening the relationship virtually? Can it be done, and how do you do it?
It's an interesting, and it's a fine line, and I can't say that I necessarily have the one size fits all answer to that question, but I will say I think if we can approach it with an attitude of playfulness and experimentation, and an openness and a willingness to explore, and maybe just to be aware of, there's that kind of resistance that comes up, or I don't know if I want to share that because I don't know if I trust this person enough to have like my face in a sexy photo, right? Or just being in a play space with it, being willing to notice and acknowledge those things and get creative. I think also we can start to maybe give ourselves more permission to get creative with it, and to notice where your boundaries lie. So maybe your budding relationship, your partner asks you for a sexy photo because they want to connect with you on that level. And you're like, well, I don't know, because, this woman I knew, she did that, and the photos came back to bite her in the ass at some point, right?
Right.
So you find out what works for you and what doesn't. Maybe you cut your head out of the photos. Maybe the photo isn't actually what makes you feel sexy. I actually had this conversation with a friend who happened to be a heterosexual male, and he is in that situation where the relationship could go one way or the other. They were on the cusp of kind of committing to each other when the quarantine happened. And he had said, and he had requested a certain picture, and there was some resistance. And he said, it's not the picture itself that I'm asking for. It's not the image. It's not the perfect butt. It's not the right lingerie. He's like, it's a turn on for me to think that she just like went into the bathroom and took a quick sexy shot of herself. Like she just unbuttoned the top button, was like, ooh, something's here for you. Like it's the titillation, the idea that she was offering that to me in that moment, and that was sexy to him, so I think being open to being in this interesting energetic exchange that's going on. And I have other people who've been like, oh, everybody's thirsting right now. I don't know if you've heard that expression, but no. It's this kind of popular term that, they're thirsting, meaning like kind of like sweating you, like you're like everyone's feeling this cabin fever, and so they're more horny. So it's interesting. I think just being willing to play with that energy, and because now more than ever, we're being forced to think of it other than in the regular, like, let's just knock boots and expend that energy, right? Like right now we're being forced to explore creative ways of tapping into that energy. And I think it's kind of an exciting thing. So I would say to just be open with it, to be aware of your boundaries, to be in dialogue with yourself, and not to do something that makes you feel uncomfortable or overexposed, but something that might maybe push your envelope a little bit and challenge you to kind of step outside your comfort zones.
You know, one of the themes of everything you said is curiosity and, you know, exploration, experimentation, and whether you end up sexting with your new budding partner or you say no to that, it's still an opportunity, like you said, to come up against your own resistance and to be vulnerable. That's one of the things that I'm valuing about this time, is that for people who can't, I love your metaphor for knocking boots. You know, I never heard that one before. I mean, I'm constantly hearing new ways of talking about sex. But, you know, because you can't knock boots right now, well, some people are throwing caution to the wind and they are hooking up, even though it's ridiculously dangerous. But if you're honoring the sheltering at home, it really is an opportunity, like you were saying, whether you're unbuttoning your blouse or you are unbuttoning your heart and saying, you know, I've had sexual trauma and it's hard for me to feel safe enough to unbutton my blouse with you. What an incredibly vulnerable offering. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's the beauty of this time too, is that you can be challenged to become vulnerable and intimate in ways that you never wanted to before, because you can't bump boots. And not just alternatives to orgasm, you know, and yeah, I can show you a picture of my penis or my vulva, you know, you can masturbate to, but which, if both of you want that, that's fine. But I'm saying there is also the opportunity to really talk more genuinely than you normally would have. And it goes back to what you were saying in the beginning, Briana, about the people who avoid talking about what's really going on because they go to work and then they come home and then they watch TV and then they go to bed and rinse and recycle. And the same thing with new relationships. People meet, they have chemistry, they start having sex, they go out, they drink, they dance, they have some more sex, you know, and they never really get to those deep issues because it's so easy to cover it up with all these fun behaviors. Mm-hmm. And now we get to say, you know what? There's a pause for a reason.
Well, and you know, it's interesting. There's a popular show on Netflix right now called Blind Date. Have you heard of this?
Mm-hmm.
Where they
never see each other.
Right. They're put in rooms adjacent to one another and they fall in love. And then, you know, the narrative evolves over, does it last outside of this controlled condition? Right. So it's interesting. It's almost like the whole world's on a blind date right now because we're in this controlled, for those of us that, as you mentioned, are honoring the sheltering, you know, restrictions. If you're honoring that, in some ways, it is creating a controlled condition, which is a fascinating thing from the perspective of, you know, sociologists and people like yourself and myself who are looking at human relationships. And is there a deepening that occurs in a situation like this, which in another circumstance we might call artificial, but in this circumstance is reality right now. Right. So I think what's really fascinating and what is hard to make predictions about is how that new reality is going to evolve, let's say, once the pandemic is over the peak, like once it starts to become less and less and less of an influence, right?
Well, isn't that the question? You know, one of the people that I interviewed for my upcoming summit, which I'll tell you about at the end, Dr. Daniel Ellenberg was talking to his Wuhan Chinese colleague who told him that as soon as the restriction for quarantine was lifted, the courthouse was overwhelmed months and months in advance with divorce filings. And so, you know, your question is a brilliant question, is, you know, what is going to happen on the other side? And doesn't that depend on the choices you make? Mm. And, you know, I'm kind of plugging this everywhere I'm talking lately, is get help, guys. You know, I know some people are in precarious financial positions, but that's going to resolve itself over time. But if you mess up your primary relationship because you didn't get help, you're going to be sorry forever. And so it's like, sit down with your partner, you know, and what would you recommend as some things that people can do besides getting help? And there's so much that people can access online, again, including the summit that you are speaking on with me. But, you know, how does this relate? Let's kind of segue back to you and your work. How does this opportunity show up people's attachment styles?
Well, you know, it's interesting. A lot of times I get the question, how can you tell the difference between a secure couple versus an insecure couple? And if the couple does not know how to communicate, like hasn't learned how to communicate from let's say an authentic or emotionally honest place, to be honest, you can't always tell the difference, because it can look the same. But if you, the way that I usually say you can tell if there are genuine incompatibilities regarding values and needs and whatnot, is you clean up the communication. And if there remain issues around proximity, then that is the insecurity that has to be dealt with. And that needs to be done within each individual at the same time of working at it in the relational space. So what I mean by that is, like, so for example, let's say there are socks on the floor. And socks on the floor really ticks off, I'm going to use a heteronormative example. So let's say socks on the floor really ticks off Annie. And Tim comes home from work, kicks off his shoes, socks on the floor, watches TV for a while, and that's like his downtime. That's when his testosterone replenishes. That's his transition, right? But Annie sees him, she wants to stimulate her oxytocin because she's in testosterone mode all day herself. So she needs to do that. She needs to connect and communicate and talk, whatever. And she sees him as being lazy, not paying attention to her, not acknowledging her, not wanting to talk to her. And the socks on the floor become the point of focus for that sense of disconnect, right? Feeling like she's not getting her intimacy needs met. So there's a couple ways that one can approach it. One can say, again, with the socks on the floor, you don't appreciate me. You don't listen to anything I say. You could care less. It's all about you, blah, 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 right? And so that's like what I call a surface level communication, where what's happening in that moment, she's angry because anger is the first emotion we jump to when we feel helpless and threatened. And his repetitive leaving the socks on the floor suggests to her that he doesn't value their connection in the same way she does. And that if he doesn't value this connection in the same way I do, then it's at threat of being dissolved. It's at threat of him having an affair. It's at threat of me not being valuable in this scenario, right? So now we're contending against the idea that I'm not good enough and this isn't living up to expectation and I'm being devalued. So rather than feeling helpless and upset and asking for connection, we get angry and we criticize, right? And this is not necessarily something that only insecure people do, or people who have insecure attachment. People who have secure attachment do this too. And it's often because that's how we are trained to communicate. And that's why I say if we can clean up the communication, but the inability to show up for each other and the needs for connection doesn't go away, then that's an insecure attachment issue. So for example, let's say she comes at Tim in that way, right? Criticizing whatever. So he could respond by saying, getting mad in response because she's criticizing, just walked in the door, like I literally just got home from work. They're just socks on the floor. What are you talking about? Like none of that is actually the case, so everything else I do for you is completely erased in 1 minute because I left some socks on the floor, right? You don't recognize anything else I do, then you don't really know me. Then you don't really love me either, blah, 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 blah. So now we've got this spiral. Now, the thing I would say is secure people and insecure people have that argument. But what the difference is, let's take Annie first, because I mentioned her first. Let's say if she were to approach it from a more secure position, she might say, ooh, I'm noticing that socks on the floor is really bothering me. And I wonder what that's about. And I wonder if it really is about socks. And let me just take a moment to pause and ask myself a few questions before I go into an emotionally charged situation. Not that she has to remove the emotion from the situation, but rather to be aware of what is the emotion that she's actually feeling, and can she articulate it accurately, right? So, Tim, I usually recommend to my clients, especially if they are heterosexual women and they are with a cisgendered male partner, that they say their name first, and that they preface whatever they're going to say with whatever degree of importance it is. Because men prioritize things in a very sequential way. Women prioritize things very horizontally. So if you say, Tim, I have something important I'd like to talk to you about. Now you got his attention, right? Now he knows it's important. Whereas if you just say, I wish I could this, that, and the other thing, they're like, yeah, that's a fantasy someday down the line, low on the priority list. But if you say, this is important to me, up, goes up, right? Rises up on the list. Okay. And then I usually recommend that you start with a statement of appreciation, because if you feel like you want something, it's because you are if you feel like you're not getting enough of something, I should say, it's because you are recognizing in that moment that you love the thing that you want, right? So rather than focusing on the lack of the thing, focus on the feeling, the joyful feeling that you get in relationship to it, because that's why you're wanting it. So
and you might wanting it is Tim in this case.
Right. So Tim, I just want to start by saying I appreciate all that you do. I know you go to work and you work hard, and this is how you contribute to the family. And I understand that all you want to do is kick off your shoes when you come home. But I'm noticing the socks on the floor is a recurring thing. And I have to be honest, it's creating a certain feeling within me, and it's it's making me angry. And I'm wondering if we might be able to talk about some solutions to this, because I'm just not knowing where this anger is coming from, and if maybe we can have a conversation about it. And maybe he'll say, oh, well, wow, I had no idea. How long have you been holding on to that? Well, it's just socks on the floor. I mean, we could move the laundry basket to the bottom of the stairs, or I could stuff them in my shoes and take them up after dinner. I'm sure that we can work out a solution for this. And maybe Annie accepts one of these things, or maybe she makes a suggestion and they agree on it. And then he says something like, really? Then so there's a part of him that feels like amused that was all it took to please her, right? That she says it would actually be a gesture of love and a big consideration for me if you were to take care of that. I would take it as a gesture of loving consideration from you. And so let's say he obliges her, and then he's amused because, wow, it was just that easy to get her, to make her that happy. What else can I do to make you feel appreciated tonight? So it's that sense of amusement that makes him secure. Because if he were insecure, instantly he would think she's trying to control him. Instantly he would think she's emotionally manipulating him. Instantly his response would be to take some space. Now I need some space from her because she's a critical bitch, right? Who makes a big deal out of nothing. So if we can clean up the communication, now we notice what are the underlying responses. Does Tim actually need space? Does she actually need to yell at him about socks? Or does she just need to feel like he's willing to have a conversation about her needs? And does Tim just need to feel like it's actually easy to please her? Right?
And isn't there another, you started to allude to it, is I notice that I'm being triggered by the socks on the floor. I wonder why. You started out with that, and I love that perspective, which is, and approaching him with, I love you and I want to clear this up because I notice I'm having a reaction that may not even be about you. Mm-hmm. Isn't that possible also, that when she brings it from that perspective, that she may say, you know what, I'm just remembering that my dad used to do that right before he left my mom. And so, I take it back. I don't care if you leave your socks out there. I know you adore me, and the socks mean nothing. And then he would take her in his arms, and, and forever after, the socks could be a symbol of her freedom. He doesn't have to fix the socks. He has to, they have to find a way to connect, right?
Right. And I would add too, maybe she doesn't even have, that's a very savvy person who can make those connections. Maybe she doesn't even make that connection. But the paradox is, even when you're willing to question yourself, the paradox is that's when you really start to know yourself, right?
Yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's when she starts to know herself. Because in noticing and then disidentifying, like, so I think emotions are information. So they're not meant to be put in charge, but they're also not meant to be ignored.
Right.
I think they're information. And so if we can kind of, what I like to call, like, take a moon's eye view, but if we can kind of disidentify with the impulse,
Mm-hmm.
and just breathe, like, just take one breath, and like, just give yourself, like, promise to yourself, if I have a strong emotion, I promise I'm always going to take one deep breath, before I act on it. Then that's going to create just a little window at first, but then over time, it'll get a little bit bigger, and that affects some energetic spaciousness inside around whatever the affective energy of the emotion might be. And now you're not responding to it as if it were in charge of you, but rather that it's important information for you, and it's going to tell you some really good things about yourself.
Love
but you're
that.
the one who knows those things about yourself, right? You're the one who's organizing that information, not the other way around.
Well, I love that because, you're in that pause, you're connecting to the whole you, right? You're not just your emotions. You have a lot more power than just that. Mm-hmm. And what about the situation, Briana, in which you have this trigger of socks on the floor because of your own history, and you've dived into it enough times that now, and you've talked to it, to your husband about it, and that it would mean so much to you as a symbol. It's not really his love, it's just a symbol. Mm-hmm. But he keeps doing it. When is there, and my husband and I have been through this 100 times, is I have my trigger, and then that triggers his trigger, and then he tries to blame me for his trigger, and I'm blaming him for my trigger, blah, blah, blah. But recently we've been able to say, okay, this is why I have that trigger. And then he says, okay, well, let's look at why I have that trigger. Mm-hmm. Because it could be that the guy, just like you said, she's interpreting it as, he's interpreting it as she's trying to dominate me and she's just a controlling bitch. Mm-hmm. He may be putting those socks on the floor unconsciously on purpose to tell her she can't make him do anything. And how do you, how would you approach that? And I wonder, do you say, I wonder why this is still happening? And, I wonder what it's a trigger for you, honey. Is there?
Yeah, I think that would be a great conversation, because if someone feels compelled to even subconsciously, or we might say passive aggressively, leave socks as a way, because there's sort of two things happening there. Number one, trying to show that you can't control me, right? And number two, looking for a confrontation. So both of those things suggest to me that there's a desire for contact. Whenever we do things around control, whether it's exerting control or trying to rebuff control, it's because we are feeling disconnected. And sometimes people experience connection through power plays. They experience connection through conflict, because that's the only time that emotions were unleashed, right? At any other time, emotion is strictly relegated to behaving in a certain way. And if you have an emotion or impulse outside of those boxes, then you are rejected and thus experience disconnection, right? So the socks continuing to remain on the floor may be, I would say, a bid for contact.
I love that, Briana. I love that. I used to, my daughter's father was short, like 5'5", and he had the quintessential little man complex, and he always wanted attention. And one of the ways that he would do it that just irritated the shit out of me was when he would pull into the driveway, he would take up the whole driveway. So nobody could go in or out. No matter how big the driveway was or the parking area was, he would try to take up the whole space. And
I may be little, but I have a big presence, and you're going to see me and you're going to respect me and acknowledge me.
Exactly. Just like the socks, except, on a bigger level. But, it is so different emotionally on the side of the person observing that. if you can do exactly what you said. I just think that was brilliant what you said about it's a bid for connection. Mm-hmm. in an adolescent, immature, unconscious way, but who cares? It's still a bid for connection, and oh my God, it like makes your heart melt instead of pissing you off.
Yeah, well, that's the challenge, is to be able to identify it in that way and approach it from that angle, right? Because almost always whatever it is that catches your attention will be the thing that triggers you too, right?
Exactly, but that's what you're talking about is, identify your trigger and then you can see the truth.
Yeah.
I just think that is so brilliant to remember that so many things that irritate us so much are actually just a person's desire to connect, and they just can't say so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, it's interesting how when we do experience a deep sense of connection, if I can give you an example of this. So I used to date someone. It's last long-term relationship I had. And when we first started dating, he would always preface, like, we started sleeping together and then we dated for about a little over a year. And we got very close very quickly. It was a very fiery kind of relationship. But one of the things that happened in the beginning of the relationship was he would say, he wanted to make sure I knew off the bat that he was not a cuddler. He was not a cuddler, and he wasn't going to cuddle. Which he would talk a big game.
I know where this is headed, so I just laugh.
Talk a big game, and I'm like, all right, I'm not a cuddler either. Chill out. So then, so he would always say that, and yet somehow in the end, he would always end up cuddling me. So finally, but then he would say, okay, are you asleep? Or I would say something like, how about you just cuddle me until I'm asleep, and then you can do whatever you need to do. And so he'd make a joke, like we'd be cuddling for like a couple minutes, like, are you asleep yet? And I used to entertain it, but at one point it really got to me, because I was like, we're getting this deepening intimacy is happening, and when you keep doing this, it's like he keeps trying to pull away from it. So finally I said to him, look, when you cuddle me, I feel safe, I feel protected, it makes me feel warm and invited, and it makes me feel really good. I'm not trying to steal something from you. And he had no issue cuddling me after that. And it wasn't even like a discussion. I'd wake up, his legs and arms would be wrapped around me like this. And he had military history, so I think there were a few key words I used, which were safe and protected. And I think for him, that spoke to his sense of masculinity and his honor as a man. But the other piece was, I'm not trying to steal something from you. And I think he had in previous relationships felt like women were manipulating him into giving them more than he wanted to give. And so I think he always felt like he was holding back, because if he gave a little, he thought they would take, like you give a little, what is that expression? You give an inch, they'll take a mile, or something like that. I think he had that perception. If I give an inch, she'll take a mile. And whatever I said, like, clicked for him, and there was no issue about it after that. But,
it's so funny. I started laughing immediately because when I got together with my husband 13 years ago, he would constantly say, you need affection a lot more than I do. You need affection a lot more than I do. And over time, and all the, we're both into being in coaching, counseling, spiritual groups, so forth. So over time, it really has shown up that he's actually much more dependent than I am. Mm-hmm. Much more dependent than I am. And I think that, your boyfriend and my husband, it's like that macho ego thing of, I'm not needy, you are.
Yeah.
And, when it's so interesting, because once your guy felt safe and once my guy felt safe, it's like, then they can show their own needs. It's not even about meeting your needs. You would wake up and he would be all over you. So it's like, it's so interesting. Again, it reminds me back to the socks being a bid for connection, is how often men are not taught how to express their emotions. And so how often they are projecting what they need onto you. And
well, and yes, I would say that's true in many heteronormative situations. In the frame of attachment, I think what I've been noticing lately is that the gender lines along which that it manifests itself are becoming more blurred. It's becoming more. I actually see that. Yeah, I see that happening a lot for women, and also seeing the other thing happen where, that maybe going back to what I was mentioning before about alpha and omega. Like, I think it's interesting because we're starting to see more now that there's so much more permission around gender expression and so much more permission around how we express ourselves in relationship, and also these dimensions of energetic, expression, that in some ways it can be confusing for people, but also I feel like it creates so much, it opens things up so much, like there's so much more permission for us to explore these different dimensions. And maybe part of it is that we can play with the language with which we're describing, these energetic experiences. And then it allows us to to be seated in our, I'm going to call it alpha energy versus being seated in our omega energy. And almost like if I were to reframe what we're talking about in that language, like he was like you were sort of holding the omega energy, right? Or like you were holding the affectionate, the expressive, the what we traditionally call feminine energy, right? And you need that. Meanwhile, he is with you because that's balancing something that he's actually wanting to experience for himself, right? And it sounds like over time, as he became increasingly safe with you, now he's allowed some of that to emerge in his own experience, right? I don't know if he's acknowledged it in his own experience, yes, but you have witnessed it.
Yes, he's acknowledged it. I mean, yeah. I think that's, I don't know, for me, it's a very liberating thing when each partner can acknowledge what's going on, not just shift their behavior, but acknowledge it. It's, to me, it's so liberating.
Yeah. I agree.
Because like you were saying about the alpha omega and the expanded way of expressing ourselves, there's no shame about any of it. Yeah. He loves it. We love to spoon, and he loves me to spoon him. Oh my God, he just loves that. And I love him to spoon me because it's exactly what you were saying, feeling safe and protected. Mm-hmm. So let's go back to the pandemic time and kind of summarize all of this. Is all the things you've been talking about are such rich opportunities for us to explore right now. And you mentioned how often people are being triggered right now. Whether it's a brand new relationship, you're still going to be triggered if you're willing to say it. I'm sure you've had clients who say, "Oh, I don't want to tell them that. We're too new. I don't want to ruin anything and be real." Yeah. Basically is what they're saying. But to me, would you agree with that this is a great opportunity to risk being real?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I would say we always want to risk that. But yeah, the circumstances in and of itself, I mean, what do you have to lose?
Exactly, especially for those couples that are meeting online and you're not going to be able to have sex for 3 months. It's like, let's weed through the people that aren't our guy or our woman.
Isn't this a fabulous paradox that people who, and we're talking about this, the way technology has made us these sort of instant gratification kind of culture, and yet, now it is technology which is serving us as we are no longer able to do the instant gratification. It's such an interesting paradoxical time in that respect,
Absolutely. And I just, I want to encourage people to use this time to risk doing some new things. Don't just, I'm saying this to all my clients and my viewers and so forth, is don't use this time as a way to just go numb and watch TV endlessly. And, people are saying, here's my morning pajamas and here's my afternoon pajamas. It's like, no, get up, make a life for yourself. decide, who do you want to be on the other side of this? How do you want to have your relationship on the other side of this? And, listen to Briana's suggestions about how to talk to each other and use those opportunities to be better, be stronger, be more willing to be open on the other side.
Mm-hmm. While at the same time being gentle with yourself.
Absolutely. Always being compassionate with yourself.
Yeah.
Always. But it's, again, there's the alpha and the omega, is we need that thrusting energy of pushing ourselves to be better than we were yesterday, and we need the omega of, and I love you no matter what.
That's the paradox, right?
That's the paradox. So I want to put in a plug for the summit that is launching April 20th. It's called Sacred Sexuality Revealed, Secrets of Passionate Intimacy, Deeper Connection, and Lasting Desire. And Briana is one of the really wonderful 30 experts that are talking about this topic. So, you're going to want to sign up for that, and you can access it at sacredsexseries.com. And tell us how people can access you individually. I know you have a YouTube channel because you interviewed me last week or sometime recently. Tell us about all the places people can find you, Briana.
Sure. Well, through the Sacred Sexuality Summit that Helen is hosting, you can also access, I have a free mini course that I'm giving away. It's valued at $167, but this is free for anyone that signs up for Helen's summit. So definitely check that out. It's called 4 Steps to Passionate Partnership, and it's a 4-part video series that helps you access creative arts modalities for getting in touch with your own energy and also being able to connect in with your, let's say, what I call your essential self or your true self, but being able to experience a sense of security while at the same time calling in a passionate partnership. The other places I am on YouTube, as you mentioned, it's just my first and last name. On Instagram, same thing, first and last name. And you can also check out my website, my first and last name.
Which is Briana MacWilliam.
That's correct.
Okay, so thank you so much for taking time to be with us today, Briana. I love your work. I feel so much synchronicity with the way you think about bringing neutrality and owning our reactivity and, saying things with love. And it's just a beautiful paradigm. And I know you do wonderful work. And also, of course, you can contact Briana to work with her in many different ways if you connect with her on her website. So thank you so much, and stay safe and be well and thrive. I know you are, and I know you're giving all your wonderful gifts to the world during this time, and I really value that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
My honor.